Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Seth Greenman, and I am the Region 1 Master Housing Navigator through the Statewide and Regional Housing Collaboratives Grant, which was awarded to the New York Alliance for Inclusion and Innovation by the Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. Today, we will be taking a comprehensive dive into the OPWDD Housing Subsidy Program, which was formerly known as Individual Supports and Services, or ISS. The OPWDD Housing Subsidy Program is a program that provides financial assistance for OPWDD eligible adults residing in New York State. It is similar to other government-funded subsidy and rental assistance programs in that it provides the support to income-eligible people who wish to live independently in a home or apartment of their choosing and for which they are responsible. Participants in the program are expected to pay approximately 30% of their income toward their housing costs, and the housing subsidy program will pay the difference up to a county maximum. Thus, the program does not provide housing, it assists with making housing affordable to lower income people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. Unfortunately, for many people, housing costs are much higher than these county maximums, which means people are paying closer to 50% or more of their income for housing. The subsidy is also portable, meaning it can move with people throughout New York State as long as they continue to meet eligibility criteria. And it's state funded. So rather than HCBS waiver funded, you do not need to be waiver enrolled in order to access it. Historically, the housing subsidy program was known as Individual Supports and Services. With the onset of self-direction, people with intellectual or developmental disabilities were able to access the subsidy through their self-directed budgets. Or if not self-directing or waiver enrolled, they could continue accessing the program directly through ISS. In 2020, OPWDD began to consolidate the guidance for the ISS housing subsidy program and the subsidy through self-direction into one program with standardized guidance titled the OPWDD Housing Subsidy Program. Therefore, we will be referring to the program according to this new title throughout the presentation, as well as referencing the standardized guidance that has been released as of this recording date. However, you will hear it referred to by any and all of its other names when interacting with service providers and people receiving the service. As previously mentioned, eligibility for the housing subsidy program requires that the person is 18 years or older and has OPWDD eligibility. HCBS waiver enrollment is not required. Additionally, the person must be responsible for the living situation, both legally and financially. This means one of two things. If renting, the person is a legal tenant and a valid leaseholder, or if an ownership situation, the person is on the mortgage and therefore legally and financially responsible for the monthly payments. One question that arises is related to occupancy. Occupants, if not leaseholders, do not qualify for the program since they are not legally and financially responsible. Additionally, living in the family home, even as an adult child, does not qualify the person for the subsidy since there's no legal or financial responsibility. We will look at this a bit more on the next slide, but generally the overarching criteria used to determine if the person is eligible is, are they legally and financially responsible, and is there supporting documentation to this fact? If the first three eligibility requirements are met, as noted on the slide, the person must also undergo a certification process of their home and income as part of the initial application process for the housing subsidy program. The certification is in quotes, so as not to confuse it with certified placement through OPWDD, such as a group home. We will look at these requirements in more detail in upcoming slides. Another point worth mentioning here is that living with others does not disqualify the person from being eligible for a subsidy. However, it will likely change the subsidy amount. So whether dependent children, spouses, significant others, roommates, housemates, living caregivers, if there's any others living in the home, this will be factored in when the subsidy amount is calculated. Finally, written guidance from OPWDD issued on February 11th, 2021 indicated that the person must, quote, have obtained or applied for all other federal, state, or local money for housing before asking OPWDD for a subsidy, end quote. While it is too early to tell what OPWDD's expectations are concerning this, it may include applying for a Section 8 housing choice voucher or assistance from USDA if the person is living in a rural area. If one of these waitlists are open, we strongly recommend applying anyway, since it's likely you will receive more financial assistance than from the OPWDD housing subsidy, which we'll talk more about later. However, many of these waitlists are closed, so meeting the eligibility requirement may be as simple as demonstrating that there isn't another available option. Ultimately, if you are seeking financial assistance to pay for housing, it is important to investigate all options that are available to you in order to be able to demonstrate this to the DDRO, as well as to ensure you're accessing the services and assistance that best meets your needs. So this question comes up all the time. Can an OPWDD eligible adult living in the family home receive a housing subsidy? The simple answer is no, unless specific criteria are met. First, the space or unit in the family home must be available to rent to the general public. This is typically the stopping point in the discussion of family homes, since they often are not set up as standalone rentals. One way that providers have checked this in the past is by requesting the certificate of occupancy, or the C of O. This means that a bedroom or even an in-law apartment doesn't qualify the person to receive a housing subsidy unless it has a current C of O. If there is a C of O, then OPWDD also wants to verify that the rental unit meets their quality assurance standards, which includes criteria such as a private bathroom and functional kitchen space. On February 11th, 2021, OPWDD issued a standardized checklist to be used across the state for this purpose, which is more detailed than the regional list used previously. We will discuss this more later. Finally, if the first two criteria are met, then the provider agency must also verify that the person will no longer receive respite or FSS type supports, such as family reimbursed respite, family reimbursement, etc., once they have moved into the new space and the housing subsidy is active. We're very grateful to the OPWDD Region 1 non-certified housing team, who has allowed us to share this resource here on this slide. They developed this decision tree to help guide discussions of eligibility related to the OPWDD housing subsidy program. It is a very helpful tool that incorporates the various elements of eligibility discussed previously, including the criteria for approval of a housing subsidy for a unit in the family home. And it can be utilized in conjunction with support from the local DDRO and self-direction team. It is included here as a reference tool that we recommend utilizing when engaging in these discussions. So on to the application process. As mentioned previously, there are two routes to access the OPWDD housing subsidy, and it is important to understand how they are similar and how they differ. Regardless of the route, the initial step in applying for the subsidy is receiving a service authorization from the DDRO, but each route differs greatly in the steps required to obtain this authorization. So first, if not self-directing, and you're pursuing the subsidy through the process formerly referred to as ISS, then a regional form is required. Currently, this regional form is called the ISS authorization request, and it must be obtained and completed, typically by the care manager, although this isn't required. The form outlines the request as well as the justification supporting the need for a housing subsidy. Accompanying this form must be the current life plan as well as any supporting documentation necessary to justify the stated need. The identified housing subsidy provider agency, or formerly known as ISS provider agency, then reviews and submits these documents to the DDRO, so it is important to work closely with the housing subsidy provider agency to ensure you have the current and correct authorization forms. This is especially true right now as OPWDD standardizes their guidance, since there may be changes or further standardization to this form in the future. If pursuing the subsidy through self-direction, the second route, the HCBS waiver is required in addition to OPWDD eligibility. It is beyond the scope of this presentation to discuss the front door and the HCBS waiver applications, but whether pursuing through self-direction, through the front door, or completing a service amendment request form, the authorization to self-direct services and hire a broker and a fiscal intermediary is required. The person must work with a broker and fiscal intermediary to complete and submit a startup budget request for approval of startup brokerage services. This approved startup budget is required to begin planning all self-direction services, including the housing subsidy. Either way, it is important to identify and work closely with either the housing subsidy provider agency or the fiscal intermediary in obtaining the necessary service authorization and moving on to completing the housing subsidy application packet. Okay, so on to the application process. This second and slightly more uniform step to applying for the OPWDD housing subsidy program is completion of what we'll call the application packet. As mentioned on slide 3 in our discussion of eligibility, this is where the home and income certification steps will happen to verify the person is eligible to receive a subsidy. So income certification is completed through a complex calculation that is done within an Excel budget template provided by OPWDD. This worksheet is included in the self-direction budget template for those who are self-directing their services, or it is provided as a standalone worksheet currently called the ICS, or Individual and Community Supports Budget Template. Either way, the worksheet will calculate the person's net housing contribution, and as long as this is less than their portion of the maximum household housing subsidy for the county, they will be eligible for assistance. We'll look more at this calculation in upcoming slides, but it is important to note that accompanying this budget template must be supporting documentation for all numbers included in the calculation. This includes a lease or rental agreement to verify the monthly rental amounts, or a mortgage document to verify monthly payment. It also includes income verification documents, such as pay stubs or Social Security award letters. It should include documents verifying any deductions that are claimed in the budget template, such as rep pay fees or insurance premiums. And it should also include documents verifying monthly utility amounts and renters or homeowners insurance if these are being claimed as offsets. Home certification is provided by completing the OPWDD Housing Subsidy Quality Assurance Checklist. These checklists were historically completed by the care manager. However, it is ultimately the responsibility of the provider agency, who is the biller of record and paying out the housing subsidy, to ensure these checklists are completed, signed, and kept on file for the person. This will be either the housing subsidy provider agency or the fiscal intermediary. On February 11th, 2021, OPWDD issued a standardized participation agreement that is now required as part of the application packet. This agreement outlines the program requirements and responsibilities of each party involved in administering the housing subsidy, including the person. The person requesting the housing subsidy, along with the agency administering it, must review and sign the agreement annually. Finally, there may be additional documents required by the provider agency or the DDRO, depending on the route that the person is taking to obtain the subsidy. Historically, some regions have used documents such as a housing plan, a living alone assessment, or some other person-centered plan for the application process. But this may begin to change as OPWDD continues standardizing the guidance and providing uniform documents for statewide use. If pursuing the subsidy through self-direction, then there may be additional documentation requirements specific to the fiscal intermediary or the DDRO for the overall self-directed budget, which must be completed and submitted along with the housing documentation. Ultimately, it is important that you check with the housing subsidy provider agency or the fiscal intermediary to discuss their documentation requirements and processes. As in the first step for service authorization, the documentation for the application packet here in step 2 will be reviewed and submitted to the DDRO by the housing subsidy provider agency or fiscal intermediary, and the return of an approved budget template with an effective date will indicate acceptance and enrollment in the OPWDD housing subsidy program. As mentioned previously, OPWDD requires that the unit meet or exceed their quality assurance standards in order for the housing subsidy to be paid, regardless of the location or setup of the home. These standards are outlined in the OPWDD Housing Subsidy Quality Assurance Standards Checklist issued on February 11th, 2021. I'll just refer to it as the checklist here on out. And in most instances, these standards are actually HUD standards that guide the Housing Choice Voucher Program through Section 8, which the OPWDD Housing Subsidy Program is mirrored after. They're titled Housing Quality Standards by HUD, and they can be found in Section 401 of Part 982 of the Code of Federal Regulations that govern HUD programs, which is Title 24. The first link provided on the slide will take you to an overview of these standards provided by HUD with additional links and information that you can investigate. The second link will take you to the actual text of the regulation that is provided by the Legal Information Institute, a project of Cornell Law School. So as part of the initial application process, as well as ongoing recertification annually, OPWDD requires that provider agencies administering the housing subsidy receive and maintain a signed copy of the checklist. According to the updated memorandum issued by OPWDD on November 17, 2020, the checklist can be completed by any paid staff of approved provider agencies, including the housing subsidy provider agency, the fiscal intermediary, a care manager, a support broker, or even a community hub staff. The quality assurance standards require that basic habitability requirements are met. The checklist outlines general criteria, such as the absence of health hazards, adequate furnishings in the apartment, and the person's physical needs are being met by the dwelling. Additional standards are outlined on the checklist and fall into the following categories: bathroom and sanitation, food preparation area, security and smoke or carbon monoxide detectors, alternate means of egress, thermal environment, interior air quality and water supply, illumination and electricity, and structure and materials. In total, the checklist outlines 44 standards that must be met for the person to be approved to receive or continue receiving a housing subsidy, which is a significant increase from the regional specific QA checklist used previously that only outlined 12 standards. A quick review of the checklist will reveal that many of these standards require prior knowledge of building construction and facilities, including plumbing, electricity, heating and cooling systems, etc. But since the standardized checklist has only recently been issued at the time of this presentation, the challenges of implementation have yet to be addressed. However, housing subsidy provider agencies and fiscal intermediaries may need to grapple with how to do so in light of the level of knowledge that is required to verify compliance with these standards. Once complete, the checklist must be provided to the person, the provider agency, and to the DDRO. All standards on the checklist must be met for the dwelling to pass. If a deficiency is noted on the checklist, there is provision made for the concern to be corrected by a specific date in order for the housing subsidy to continue. However, at the time of this presentation, there's no further guidance from OPWDD regarding timelines for correction. So we recommend you follow up with the provider agency and the DDRO regarding a plan and a timeline of correction if any concerns are identified on a checklist. No matter which route you use to pursue the OPWDD housing subsidy, the calculation is processed the same, using the template provided by OPW. For our example, we'll be using screenshots from the ICS template version October 4th, 2013. That is the current template used by housing subsidy provider agencies at the time of this presentation. Within this template, there are several key calculations that will ultimately determine the final housing subsidy, and we'll review these over the next couple slides. So first, the template will calculate a maximum household housing subsidy, which you can see in the screenshot on line 54. This indicates the maximum amount of household housing costs, such as rent or mortgage payment, that will be considered when calculating the subsidy. Even if the home costs more than this max, the additional household housing costs are excluded, and the maximum will be used in the final calculation of the subsidy. If the home costs less than this maximum, then the total household housing costs will be used to calculate the subsidy instead of the maximum. These maximums are actually the HUD fair market rental rates from 2012. The OPWDD housing subsidy program hasn't updated these maximums since then. While HUD has been increasing the fair market rental values for most counties in New York State, OPWDD has remained locked into the 2012 rates, which means that in a majority of counties across the state, the subsidy amount through OPWDD will be less than the subsidy amount received by Section 8 recipients. This is why we made the recommendation at the beginning to investigate and pursue all financial assistance options available to you. So the maximum household housing subsidy is determined by the county of residence and the household information provided in the budget template. Many different scenarios are possible based upon what information is entered for the household. So in the example provided on your screen, on the slide in the screenshots, the maximum household housing subsidy of $654 is for a single person in a one-bedroom apartment or home in Monroe County. If the household information is changed to include a second person living in a two-bedroom home, the maximum increases to $799 for Monroe County. If that second person is a spouse or significant other, then the maximum will drop back to $654 regardless of the number of bedrooms. If a dependent child is added to this two-bedroom household along with the spouse or significant other, then the maximum will increase back to $799 for Monroe County. So you can see that there's many different scenarios based upon the makeup of the household and the number of bedrooms that will ultimately determine the maximum calculation that will be used in the budget template. Secondly, or the second figure here, the template will calculate an individual share of the household housing costs, which is circled in red on line 57. This is simply the household housing costs divided by the total residents identified in the home. This calculation is important as in some cases, it is what will be used to determine the person's gross housing contribution and subsidy amount. However, this can be deceiving since homes with dependent children are calculated differently. Additionally, if the individual share of the total household housing costs on line 57 is higher than the individual share of the maximum household housing subsidy on line 54, then it is ultimately their share of the maximum which will be used in the subsidy calculation. This is not always apparent when working with the template, so it is important to keep this in mind. The third calculation that is very important is the gross housing contribution. This is the portion of the person's income that should be committed toward paying rent and other housing costs. It is determined by calculating their monthly total countable income and subtracting any allowable monthly deduction amounts. So in the slide, you can see that $200 is automatically deducted in the budget template as a personal allowance equivalent. But it is important to explore additional deductions that can be claimed, including Medicaid buy-in premiums or health insurance premiums. For example, in this scenario provided, the person utilizes a rep payee service that includes a monthly fee of $42. So this is typically a deduction that can be claimed, and it reduces the person's overall net income. Other eligible deductions can be and should be explored with your local DDRO and may include out-of-pocket medical or dental expenses, such as copays, prescription copays, etc. The gross housing contribution that the person is responsible to pay is then calculated as 30% of the net income, which is there on line 48. So in this example, 30% of a net income of $639 is $192 for a person receiving SSI as their sole source of income and claiming an additional deduction of their rep payee fee of $42. So finally, and yes, for all those whose heads are swimming right now, this is the final calculation slide. The final calculation that we want to look at is the calculated maximum monthly housing subsidy allowed on line 67 there. This is a big long name for the housing subsidy or the amount that will be paid out on behalf of the person to the landlord or the lender holding the mortgage. So first, any monthly utility or insurance amounts that were entered as additional housing costs on lines 58 and 59 are subtracted from the gross housing contribution, thereby reducing the amount the person is expected to pay. In our example, the person noted that they pay an additional $30 per month in utility costs and $10 per month in insurance. Therefore, this $40 per month cost is subtracted from the $192 gross housing contribution to give this person a net housing contribution of $152. Now, this is very important for two reasons. So first off, these offsets, these costs, they cannot already be accounted for in the household housing costs on line 57. And second, the offsets are significant because these costs are included as a dollar-to-dollar reduction in the person's housing contribution, which will result in an equivalent increase in their final subsidy amount. So this means that rental insurance is indirectly paid for as an offset in the housing subsidy, so everyone should be encouraged to pursue a policy as a safeguard. Finally, the net housing contribution is subtracted from either the individual share of the total household housing costs or the individual share of the maximum household housing subsidy, whichever is less. So in our example, the maximum is less than the household housing costs. So the $152 on line 66 is subtracted from $654 on line 54 to give this person an allowable monthly housing subsidy of $502, which is circled in red there on line 67. Typically, the provider agency will pay this subsidy directly to the landlord or lender each month on behalf of the person. The person will then be responsible for paying the difference of the rent or mortgage payment, as well as their utility bills and insurance bills. One additional item that should be noted is the question on the template regarding subsidized housing. So the template asks if the person receives Section 8 or USDA Rural Development Section 521. If yes, then the person is already receiving a housing subsidy through one of these two programs, and the OPWDD housing subsidy calculation will automatically revert to $50. You can see the example there in the screenshots. If the answer is no, then nothing changes regarding the calculation process we've already discussed. So this is important for two reasons. So one, sometimes people mistakenly state that an OPWDD eligible person cannot apply for the housing subsidy program if they're already receiving subsidized housing. This is not true, as the person is eligible for the additional $50. And second, as we stated previously, OPWDD is currently stuck using the 2012 fair market rental values. So in some cases, a person may benefit financially and receive more support through an alternate subsidy program based on current FMR values. Therefore, as mentioned on slide 3, people should be supported to investigate and apply for all options for housing assistance as part of their planning process. Finally, it is important to note that many affordable housing complexes do not fit the criteria for choosing yes to this question. While the rents may be reduced to an affordable range and be available to people who meet the income limits, such as 50% of area median income, these properties are not fully subsidized by Section 8 or Section 521, and therefore you would select no to this question on the template. Regardless of the route which the person uses to pursue the OPWDD housing subsidy, recertification is required annually. In the February 11th, 2021 standardized guidance provided by OPWDD, the recertification packet must be submitted to the DDRO by November 15th each calendar year. If the initial approval for the subsidy was granted on or before September 30th, then recertification is required in November of the same calendar year as the initial subsidy was approved. For subsidies approved on or after October 1st, recertification will not be required until November of the next calendar year. Documentation requirements for the recertification packets are relatively identical to the initial application packet. The person's budget template must be reviewed and updated if there were changes. If no changes, then evidence must be provided demonstrating that the budget template was indeed reviewed. An updated lease or rental agreement is required, along with current documentation to verify all numbers used to calculate the housing subsidy, including income and deductions, utility costs, etc. The QA checklist and the participation agreement must also be reviewed and completed annually to be submitted in the recertification to the DDRO. Additionally, if there are significant changes in income or housing costs between recertification periods, the housing subsidy provider agency or fiscal intermediary should contact the DDRO regarding the need for a revision ASAP. According to the standardized guidance issued on February 11th, 2021, the person's housing subsidy must be updated if there has been a change in the budget calculation for the subsidy, resulting in a difference of at least $50 per month. This could happen if there is a large change in income or in the cost of housing. Additionally, if the person moves or the number of people living with the person changes, then the housing subsidy must be recalculated as well. Finally, if the person has chosen to no longer reside in the home that is receiving the subsidy for 30 days or more, then the guidance establishes that the DDRO must be informed in order to evaluate the continuation of the subsidy. When this presentation, while it has sought to consolidate information on the housing subsidy program, there are other resources you can and should refer to. So in 2018, OPWDD supported the development of a brochure regarding the housing subsidy program, which was referred to at that time as the Individual Supports and Services Program. It can be provided to landlords and property managers to assist with understanding the benefits of the program. The New York Housing Resource Center website hosts links to these brochures, which are available in English, Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, and Korean. Additionally, this presentation has referred several times to the standardized guidance issued by OPWDD, which was issued on November 17th, 2020, and then on February 11th, 2021. Currently, these documents are not actively listed on OPWDD's website, so we have provided the names here as reference. The current guidance, along with any updates that are issued after this presentation, should be requested from your fiscal intermediary, the Housing Subsidy Provider Agency, or the local DDRO. Finally, if you need additional information or support beyond what is being provided by your local DDRO and provider agencies, OPWDD recommends reaching out to their statewide home and community living team via their email at housing.initiatives@opwdd.ny.gov or by calling their phone number at 518-473-1973. Thank you for joining the presentation today. Additional housing resources can be found on the New York Housing Resource Center's website at nyhrc.org. Take care, and we wish you the best in your housing journey.